Yeah, it's working.
I'm curious to see how it ends.
Me too. I really am. We have 12, 13, 14. So 4 chapters.
I thought there were 16. We have a viewer.
12, 13, 14. So 5 chapters. My bad.
And then the interesting facts. Hello.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the interesting facts.
Me too.
Who's the...
I
don't think it'll show. Okay.
We're gonna get started here in a couple minutes. We thought we'd go ahead and go live and give everybody a chance. There's Carrie.
Hi guys.
We got 5 viewers.
Yay.
Y'all make sure you tell us who you are again today.
Yes, please leave your comments.
We're gonna finish up the book today.
We get to see what happens to George and his family.
There's Graceland.
Hey, Graceland. We get to see if George leads his family to safety or if something happens.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody had some really good predictions yesterday, so. There's Jennifer. Hey, Jennifer.
You know what I just realized? There's something pretty big going on tomorrow.
What?
Isn't tomorrow?
No, don't.
Yes.
Do not say it.
Somebody's having a birthday.
Yeah, it's my birthday tomorrow. She knows I don't like birthdays, so.
Y'all make sure you tell Miss Lowry happy birthday.
Be 24. So, kind of like George said in this book, his Aunt Daisy's so old, she's 22. So I guess that makes me really, really old. Hey guys.
If you're old, I'm twice your age. You're old enough to be your Kristen's age. There's Margaret. Got Rylan and Brinley maybe. Oh, hey Claire.
Hey Claire. Hi Harbor. There's Danielle Brown.
All right.
Hey Blakely, thank you.
Oh.
That's sweet.
Hey Jennifer. Well, you're just as wonderful. You should be here doing this with us.
I know, she didn't live so far.
I know.
Thank you, Addison.
Hey, Addison. All right, well, it's getting about that time.
Yeah.
We've got 16 viewers, it looks like. Y'all make sure that y'all comment so we'll know you're here.
Yep.
And so we can go back and comment. Make sure you tell this lovely lady right here happy birthday.
You
Tomorrow's
don't
her
have to.
birthday.
I'm good.
I did not tell her I was going to do that because she
Nope.
would have not let me. So,
I'm excited to see what happens to George.
Mhm.
So
I am too, and the rest of them. And at the end of today's reading, in the comments, we're going to post some questions. And we want you to comment on those questions. And or feel free to, you can shoot us an email if you have our school email. You can send us emails. But we are going to post a couple questions following the reading today. And so make sure that you stay tuned for those or go back and look at them after we've ended the live feed. So you can see what, they're pretty thought-provoking questions.
yes.
So,
And we're also going to share some fun facts about
oh
the
yeah,
Titanic.
that's
So
going to be pretty
stick
interesting.
around for that.
Right. You want to start today?
I will, yeah.
All right, go ahead.
So remember, where we left off yesterday was when the ship was sinking and they depended on George to lead his family to safety. And he remembered the safety ladders that what was his name? Mr. Andrews told him about. So that's where we're at right now. So chapter 12. There was no crowd here, just abandoned trunks and suitcases and water. It was seeping into the hallway from under the doors of some of the cabins. No wonder those people were trying to push their way upstairs. They'd probably known right away that the ship was in trouble and the bottom decks were flooding. The door to the stoker's quarters was locked. Marco handed Enzo over to George and rammed the door with his shoulder. breaking the lock. Tough man, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
George rushed inside and went to the back wall. And there it was, a ladder bolted to the wall, just like Mr. Andrews said it would be. It came through the door and shot straight up through an opening in the ceiling. George almost laughed with relief. "Bravo, George," Marco said. "Bravo, Giorgio," Enzo said, clapping. George hopped up onto the ladder with Phoebe and Aunt Daisy at his heels. George was worried about Enzo, but the little guy scrambled like a monkey right ahead of Marco. They came up in a small dining room meant for crew members, and then George led everyone down a long second-class corridor, up the grand staircase, and finally out onto the crowded boat deck. They'd made it! An officer came hurrying over to Aunt Daisy. "Madam, there is a lifeboat about to leave. You and the children must come at once." The man looked at Marco. "Women and children only, sir," he said somberly. "I'm afraid you will have to stay with the other gentlemen." Marco nodded. "Yes," he said, "I know." Phoebe had been right. There weren't enough lifeboats. Not nearly enough. What would happen to all of these men on the deck? There were hundreds of them. And what about the crew and those people down on G-deck? George's heart was pounding so hard he thought it would break through his chest. He felt dizzy and sick. Marco got down on his knees and spoke very quietly to Enzo. Enzo nodded. Marco kissed him on the forehead, and then Enzo ran over to Aunt Daisy. She picked him up. "I say he will go on a special boat ride," Marco said. "I say you will not leave him." Aunt Daisy nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I promise you that." Marco and Aunt Daisy looked at each other. Neither of them said a word, but a whole conversation seemed to happen with their eyes. Phoebe was really crying now, looking away so Enzo wouldn't see. George felt like someone was choking him. "Come on now," the officer screamed. So they left Marco, and when George turned around in just a few seconds later, he was gone. The officer led them through a crowd of men to the side of the ship, where a lifeboat hung just over the side. It was packed with people, all women and children, except for 2 sailors who stood at either end. An officer helped Phoebe over the rail, and then one of the sailors reached over and pulled her into the boat. George helped Enzo, who tumbled in next to Phoebe. Aunt Daisy had a hard time climbing over in her skirts, but George held her hand, and she finally made it. Now it was George's turn. As he took a step over the railing, someone pulled him back roughly. "No more room," the officer said. "Women and children only. Lower away," he called. "No," called Aunt Daisy, standing up in the boat. "He's only 10 years old. Wait." The lifeboat I can't read today. The lifeboat rocked and almost tipped over. Ladies shrieked. "You will drown us all," a woman shouted. "Sit down or I'll throw you over," the sailor said. And now Phoebe was screaming too. Enzo howled. George was too shocked to move. Phoebe leaped up and grabbed a hold of one of the ropes. She was trying to climb out of the lifeboat, back to George. He gasped as her hand slipped and she dangled over the sea. A sailor grabbed her around the waist and threw her into the boat. And then the boat slid down on its ropes and splashed into the water. Aunt Daisy and Phoebe were shouting up at him as the sailors rowed the boat away. George stood there at the rail, watching, his entire body shaking. He stood there for what felt like a long time after their boat disappeared into the darkness. He couldn't look down at the water, so he stared up at the sky, at all of those stars. He closed his eyes and told himself it was a nightmare. He was really asleep in his suite. Or no, he was home on the farm, in his bed, with Phoebe sleeping across the room and Papa sitting by the fire downstairs. He closed his eyes tighter. He tried to block out the terrible noises around him. He felt himself tipping to the side, and he held tighter to the rail. And then he couldn't hold on anymore. His hand slipped, and George fell, smashing his head on the deck. And then there was silence.
Oh, man.
That's not good. I wonder why they made him, if he was only 10 years old. They don't have squished him in there somewhere. It's sad.
I don't know. Let's find out what happens next. Chapter 13. Strong arms lifted George up. He felt himself being carried. "Papa?" he said. "Papa?" Why did his head hurt so much? Had the panther knocked him out of the tree? Was he sick with a fever like Mama? And whose voice was whispering in his ear? "Giorgio! Giorgio! Wake up!" George opened his eyes. Marco's amber eyes shone down on him. This was no dream. He was not sick. The Titanic was sinking. The bow was completely underwater now, and waves swept over the deck. Lounge chairs sailed past them and crashed over the side. People clung to the rails. A few slipped and were swept overboard. Marco had wrapped one arm around the railing and the other around George. "It's time to go," Marco said. "Go where?" George said, even though he knew. They were going into the water. There was nowhere else for them to go. Marco held George's arm as they climbed over the railing. "When we jump, jump as far out as you can," Marco said. "Away from the ship." George filled his lungs with the icy air. "Jump!" Marco cried. George pushed with his feet and leaped off the boat. He closed his eyes, imagining that he had enormous wings that would take him soaring into the sky. But then he hit the water, and down he went. And just when he was sure his lungs would pop, the ocean seemed to spit him back up. George sputtered. The water was so cold it felt like millions of needles were stabbing him. It hurt so much he couldn't move. Someone grabbed him by the life jacket and started dragging him away from the ship. It took George a few seconds to realize that it was Marco. He stopped to grab a door that was floating by. After helping George climb up on top, Marco found a crate for himself. It wasn't big enough to keep his feet out of the water, but it was better than nothing. The crate had a rope attached to it. Marco tied it around his arm and handed the end to George. "Hold tight," he said. They turned and stared at the ship. The entire front was underwater, and the back had risen toward the sky. It groaned and squeaked and sparked. Black smoke poured from its funnels, and the lights flickered. It was like watching a fairy tale dragon, stabbed and bleeding, fighting for its life. And finally, it seemed to give up. The groaning stopped. The lights went dark, and the Titanic sank into the bubbling black water. Down, 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 and down, until George closed his eyes. He couldn't make himself watch Mr. Andrews' beautiful ship disappear. A sound rose up around him, people calling for help, more and more people screaming and yelling, hundreds of voices swirling together like a howling wind. Marco pulled George away from the people in the wreckage. George couldn't believe how strong he was, how hard he kicked, how his arms sliced through the water. When he finally stopped, Marco was gasping for breath, exhaling cold clouds of white mist. He tightened the rope around his arm and patted George on the shoulder. "I rest now, Giorgio," he said breathlessly. He closed his eyes and put his head down on the crate. "Soon." Soon what? George was afraid to ask. Soon it would be over? Soon they would be rescued? Or soon they would be swallowed up by the darkness? George heard men talking somewhere close by. He looked around, relieved that he wasn't all by himself, and to his shock, just ahead, he saw a lifeboat. "Marco!" he said. "Wake up!" But Marco didn't move. His arms hung off the side of the crate. His feet dangled in the icy water. "Marco, we need to get to that boat." But Marco was still, and George realized that his friend had used every last ounce of strength. He'd gotten George off the sinking ship and across the icy waters. It was up to George now. He tucked the rope under his body and started paddling. The water seared his hands and arms. It was so cold it felt boiling hot, like lava. But he didn't stop until he reached the boat. It wasn't a regular wooden lifeboat. It was much smaller and made of canvas cloth. There were about 10 people crowded inside, mostly men. They all seemed dazed and frozen. Nobody spoke as George paddled up and grabbed hold of the side, but somebody pushed his hand off. "Get back," a voice said weakly. "You'll put us all in the water." "Please," George said, "we need help." George put his hand up again, but again someone pushed it off. And so George pulled Marco to the other side of the boat. He tried again. Nobody helped him, but this time nobody stopped him. It took him 3 tries, but he managed to hoist himself over the side and tumble into the boat. And now for Marco. He got up on his knees and leaned over, bracing his legs against the side of the boat as he grabbed Marco under the arms. He pulled, but Marco was attached to the crate by the rope. He tried again, yanking the rope, digging at the knot with his frozen fingers, but the knot was like rusted metal. George struggled, and water sloshed over the side of the boat. "Just let him go," one of the men said weakly. "It's hopeless." But George kept working on the rope, trying now to break it away from the crate. He was pulling so hard that at first he didn't notice that Marco was slipping into the sea. "Please, somebody," George screamed. "Can't you help us?" A woman from the front of the boat climbed back to George. She wore a black coat, her head and face hidden by a flowered shawl. As she pushed George aside, she pulled something out of her coat. A knife. With a clean cut, she sliced the rope and helped George pull Marco into the boat. Her hands looked surprisingly strong. George fell back, exhausted. "Thank you," George said to the woman through his chattering teeth. The woman didn't say anything, and suddenly George noticed a knife, a Bowie knife with an elkhorn handle. George looked up. Under the shawl, two glittering blue eyes looked back at him. The scar-faced man. He had saved Marco's life. Without a word, he handed George his knife, and then he looked away. Wow.
That's interesting how he kind of circled around there.
It is.
Okay, chapter 14. The cold pressed down on George until it seemed to crush his bones. He huddled close to Marco, trying to keep them both warm. Marco barely moved. Some of the men sang softly. Others prayed. Some made no sounds at all. Hours went by. The sea became rougher, and every few minutes a wave splashed into the boat. George was drifting off to sleep when one of the men shouted, "It's a ship!" And sure enough, a bright light was heading toward them. "No," another man said, "it's just lightning." But the light was getting bigger and brighter. George stared at the light, afraid that if he even blinked it would disappear. But soon he could see the outline of a gigantic ship steaming toward them. He whispered to Marco, who barely fluttered his eyes. He pulled his friend closer, rubbing his arms. "It won't be long," he whispered. "Hang on." As the sky brightened, George gaped at the scene around him. It was as if they'd fallen through a hole in the ocean and come out on the other side of the earth. There were icebergs all around them, hundreds of them, as far as George could see. They sparkled in the golden pink light. They were so beautiful, but looking at them sent a chill up George's spine. As the ship got closer, George could see that it was a passenger steamer, like the Titanic. Closer and closer it came, until George could read its name, Carpathia. Did I say that right? Mm-hmm. There were people crowded on the deck, looking over the rail. They were yelling and shouting and waving, but one voice rose above all others, like a siren. "Papa! Papa! Giorgio!" Marco's eyes fluttered, and he smiled a little. "Enzo," he whispered. George could see the little boy waving frantically from Aunt Daisy's arms. Phoebe stood next to them, waving, with the sunlight glinting off her spectacles. "They're safe, Marco," George said. "They made it." George grabbed Marco's hand. "And so did we."
Woo! I got intense.
I was afraid something bad would happen.
Yeah, me too. Y'all still there? Whew, okay.
Is it hot in here?
Yeah, it's hot in here. I've been all stressed out. All right, chapter 15. Those first 2 days on the Carpathia were a blur. George mostly slept on a bed of blankets and pillows on the floor of the first-class lounge, but he sensed that Phoebe and Aunt Daisy never left his side. He sometimes heard Enzo singing softly to him in Italian, his breath hot on George's cheek. He heard Aunt Daisy and Phoebe talking about Marco, whose feet were badly frozen, about the Carpathia's passengers who couldn't do enough for them all, about the hundreds and hundreds of people who didn't make it out of the water. Slowly, George felt stronger, and on their last night at sea, he was able to go out onto the deck with Phoebe. They sat on a bench wrapped in a blanket. A stewardess came over and gave them each a mug of warm milk. Phoebe looked up at the sky as she warmed her hands on her mug. "I finally saw a shooting star when I was on the lifeboat," she said. You can guess what I wished for.
Oh.
No. George reached for her hand. Yes, of course he knew. On the bench next to them sat two women. Both were crying. Probably they'd lost their husbands, or brothers, or fathers. There hadn't been enough wishing stars for everyone that night. Phoebe said that only about 700 of them made it out of the water. Phoebe leaned in close to George. Her coat smelled like rosewater. A lady from the Carpathia had given it to her. Have you wondered, she asked quietly, if maybe there was really if there really was a curse? At first, George didn't understand that Phoebe was talking about the mummy. With all that had happened, George hadn't thought about it, but now it hit him. How strange it was that the ship had collided with the iceberg at the exact moment the scar-faced man had opened the lid of Mr. Burroughs' crate. I guess we'll never know, George said. But the next evening, as the Carpathia was closing in on New York Harbor, George and Phoebe overheard a skinny man with a beard speaking to an officer. Before the Titanic, I was traveling in Egypt, a place called Thebes, the man said. I explored a magnificent tomb of a royal family. Phoebe's eyes bugged out, and before George could stop her, she had marched over to the man. Excuse me, she said, are you Mr. Burroughs? Yes, I am, the man replied. Phoebe took a big breath. Mr. Burroughs, she said, this might sound like a very strange question, but did you bring a mummy on board the Titanic? The man looked at Phoebe. A mummy? He said. Yes, she said. We heard it was a princess. Mr. Burroughs' eyes were tired and sad, but he smiled a little. My princess, he said. Yes. So there was a mummy, Phoebe exclaimed. No, child, he said. One should never take a mummy from a tomb. That is very bad luck. Princess was my cat. She passed away on my trip to Egypt, and so I had her wrapped so I could bring her back with me. So the princess was a cat? Yes, he said sadly. The most beautiful cat that ever lived. Well, that took kind of a turn, didn't it?
That's kind of funny.
It's sad, but I'm trying not to laugh.
Yeah, not funny that his cat died, but it's funny that they thought it was a mummy.
All right, so 3 hours later, just after 9 o'clock, the Carpathia docked in New York City in a thunderstorm. There were thousands of people waiting on the pier, but the first person George saw as they walked down the gangplank was Papa. He rushed up to George and Phoebe, grabbing them both and pulling them to him. All around them, people cried with happiness. Others just cried, their tears mixing with the pouring rain. They introduced Papa to Marco and Enzo, but there wasn't much time to talk. Their train to Millerstown was leaving soon, and an ambulance was waiting to take Marco to the hospital. Luckily, George didn't have to say a real goodbye to Marco and Enzo. Aunt Daisy was staying in New York City to take care of Enzo until Marco's feet were healed, and then they would come with her for a visit to Millerstown. Seeing the way Marco and Aunt Daisy were looking at each other, George wondered if maybe Marco and Enzo would stay forever. George sure hoped so. As they rode to the train station, newsboys screamed from every street corner, "Read all about it! Titanic survivors in New York! More than 1,500 people dead! Read all about it!" George covered his ears. He wanted to forget everything about the Titanic. He wanted to put it out of his mind forever.
Okay, the last chapter, chapter 16. But he couldn't forget. Even back on the farm, surrounded by friends from school and neighbors from town, he felt like he was still drifting on the dark ocean. And each day that went by, he felt drifting farther away. At night, when he got into bed, he'd see the faces of all those scared people on G-deck. He'd see the ship disappearing into the sea. He remembered the stabbing cold and the screams of hundreds of people crying for help. He didn't bother trying to fall asleep. Each night, after Phoebe and Papa were in bed, he went out into the woods. He was heading back to the house one night when he heard a noise through the bushes. Something was there. He could sense it. The panther? He took out his knife, fighting the urge to run away, and peered through the branches. George stared in shock. It was Papa. He was sitting on a large rock, looking up at the sky, smoking his pipe. He looked like he'd been there for quite some time. Papa turned. He didn't look especially surprised to see George. Sorry to give you a scare, he said. What are you doing here? George asked. Don't know, Papa said. Sometimes I just come here when I can't sleep. George couldn't believe it. How many nights had they both been out in the woods at the same time? Papa eased himself off the rock and began walking back toward the house. I'll take you up to your bed. No, Papa, George said. I come to the woods too. Papa looked at him with a very slight smile. I know that, he said. Papa knew? What else did Papa know about George? What else didn't George know about Papa? He and his father looked at each other. Really looked, for the first time in a long while, maybe since Mama died. Suddenly, George started to cry. They took him by surprise, his tears, and he couldn't stop. He cried for all those people who didn't make it out of the water. He cried because somehow he did. He cried because he knew that no matter how much time went by, a part of him would still be out in that ocean. He would never forget. Papa held George's hand and didn't say a word, and then he led George over to the boulder where they sat together under the stars. George stared up at the sky. Were those really the same stars that had burned so brightly above the black ocean that night? Was he really still the same boy? George, who couldn't stay out of trouble. George, who didn't try hard at school. George, who found the escape ladders. George, who pulled Marco to that lifeboat. George, who didn't give up. They sat on the boulder for a long time, and as the sun started to peep over the trees, George told Papa about Mr. Andrews. He said he thought one day I'd build a ship. Papa didn't laugh. He puffed on his pipe, looking thoughtful. How about we build one together, Papa said. A nice little boat for the pond. I always wanted to do that. That's a good idea, George said. A great idea. We can start today, Papa said, standing up and holding out his hand. They walked back to the house together. The birds were singing softly. The chickens were squawking for breakfast. A breeze was whispering through the trees, and a voice seemed to sing to George very softly, Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams. Papa looked out into the woods like he could hear it too. And that's the end of it.
Okay,
that was
so
good.
Yeah, that was good. So we know that George and his family and his friends survived, but a lot of people did not. And so there's a very, very short little story here. I mean, it's just a page and a half from the author, Lauren Tarshis. So I'm going to read that to you real quick. It says, My Titanic Story. This book is a work of historical fiction. That means that all the facts about the Titanic are true, but the main characters came from my imagination. George, Phoebe, Aunt Daisy, Marco, and Enzo are based on people I learned about while researching the Titanic. By the time I finished writing this book, they sure felt real to me. I can see George now relaxing in the little boat he and Papa built, rowing around their pond while Phoebe watches from the shore reading a book about dinosaur fossils. I can picture Aunt Daisy and Marco's wedding, how Enzo would run down the aisle with a huge grin on his face. That's my favorite part of being a writer, giving my characters happiness in the end. If only I could do the same for the 1,517 people who did not survive the sinking of the Titanic. What a sad and terrible story. One day, as I was trying to finish the book, I needed a break, so I went to New York City with my 11-year-old son, Dylan. We stopped to rest in one of my favorite neighborhoods, in a tiny park on West 106th Street and Broadway with trees and a bronze statue of a woman lying on her side. I read the gold writing engraved in a marble bench, and to my surprise, I saw that the entire park was a memorial to two famous New Yorkers who died on the Titanic, Isidore and Ida Strauss. I couldn't forget the Titanic. It seemed not even for an afternoon, and nearly 100 years later, the world hasn't forgotten either. Lauren Tarshis.
It's been over 100 years now.
Yeah. So here's some pretty cool facts about the Titanic. It says, more has been written about the Titanic than any other disaster in modern history. I tried to include as much information as I could in the book, but here are some more amazing facts that I wanted to share with you.
I'll read the first one.
Okay.
The Titanic was the largest ship, the largest moving object ever built. It weighed close to 50,000 tons and was 11 stories tall and 4 city blocks long.
Wow, that's big.
Mm-hmm.
There were 2,229 people on board. 1,316 passengers and 913 crew members. Survivors include 498 passengers and 250 members of the crew.
The passengers came from 28 different countries, including many from America, England, Ireland, and Finland. There were a few passengers from China, Japan, Mexico, and South Africa. Most of the crew members were from England and Ireland.
There were 9 dogs on the Titanic. They stayed in kennels, but their owners could take them out onto the decks for walks. 2 Pomeranians and 1 Pekingese survived with their masters.
After the sinking of the Titanic, laws were changed to require all ships to carry enough lifeboats for every passenger and crew member.
For decades, divers, scientists, and treasure hunters searched for the wreck of the Titanic. It was finally located in 1985 by a team led by U.S. scientist Robert Ballard, 2.5 miles below the surface of the sea. Wow.
Ballard and his team did not take anything from the wreck. Dr. Ballard believes the Titanic should rest in peace as a memorial to those who died, but he couldn't stop treasure hunters from diving to the wreck and removing thousands of artifacts, jewelry, dishes, clothes, and even the ship's hull.
Wow.
Wow. It was a very good book.
Yeah, it was a good book. Don't forget, we're going to post some questions in the comments, so be watching for those. Thank y'all for joining us. We had a really good time reading the book to you, and officially tomorrow starts our spring break.
Yeah.
So, but keep reading because, of course, it always makes you a better writer and a better reader and just a better person all around.
Yep, and reading is just, you can take your mind off things going around us, and it can, I love reading. So I encourage you to all read a good book over break. So
make sure you signed in. If you didn't, make sure that you said hey, so we'll know that you were here, and we'll be commenting and replying to your comments, and make sure you look for those questions after we end the live feed. Guys, we'll see y'all later. Have a safe spring break.
yes, bye.
Bye.